LinkedIn News.
If we wait to do something until we feel like doing it, almost guaranteed we're not going to do it. So it has to be this idea that, again, it becomes, it's sad but true. It becomes sort of a value, like I will do this action because I committed to doing this action, knowing that I don't want to do this action, but having learned that when I do it, my day goes better. And when my days go better, my weeks go better, and my weeks go better, my life goes better.
That's scientist and best-selling author Anna Lembke. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and here at Everyday Better, we are always striving to take care of our well-being, which absolutely includes our mental health, whether we're at home, at work, or in our relationships. So all month, we're focusing on the most common, yet least understood mental health challenges. And today, I'm sitting down with the author of Dopamine Nation, Anna Lembke. Anna's an expert in addiction, which not all of us have experienced, but we all know what it's like to try and fail to break an unhealthy habit. So her research on dopamine is relevant for everybody. We'll be right back with Anna in just a few moments. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually in relationship to others and to the world around us. As regular listeners of the show will know, I recently gave birth to my first baby. And as I adjust to my life as a new mom, my lovely producers, Grace and Emily, are helping me out. I'm going to let them take over for just a few moments, and then I'll be back with you for the rest of the show.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, Emily.
I have perhaps a vulnerable question for you.
Okay.
When was the last time you caught yourself doing something even though you told yourself you were going to stop, but you just kept doing it?
Ooh, okay. I always tell myself I'm not going to watch TV before bed because how many times have we heard on this show that staring at a screen before trying to go to sleep just ruins your sleep?
Yeah, I can hear past guests yelling at us.
Yeah, but then I get into bed and my book is there, but I don't want to read the book. I want to just watch TV. And right now I'm watching Hacks, in case you're wondering.
And is it hard? My problem with watching TV is I often tell myself I'm going to watch one and then a hook happens and I'm like, whatever, it's only half an hour more. Or do you not struggle with that?
No, of course I do. And my rationale in quotes is you know what? You deserve it.
Yes, yeah.
But what do I deserve? To feel tired?
Right. Well, I can fully relate to this. And this is, if you had asked me this question, it would have been so easy for me to come up with the answer. It's immediate.
Yeah.
And it's so embarrassing because the answer is TikTok. And it's so embarrassing as a grown adult to have to say that.
You and everybody else. That's why I can't download it.
I was at a party the other day with a bunch of people in their 30s and people were telling me that they were spending 2 to 4 hours a day on TikTok, which I'm not that bad, and no shame to anybody who is, because these are my smart, intelligent, creative friends.
Right.
But it's a problem. And I got into the habit during COVID, fully aware that I was using it as an emotional crutch. And knowing that I would feel better if I had spent the time reading or talking to my partner. But recently, I've actually made huge strides in my screen time. I have been deleting TikTok during the week and only having it on the weekends. And actually, I find myself much less likely to scroll on the weekends because I'm I should be at the park. I should be hanging out with my friends. I should be cleaning my apartment. The weekends are so limited. While on the weekdays, it's kind of maybe I'm grumpy from my day and I'm just I'm going to be bad and scroll TikTok.
I deserve it. Yeah.
I deserve to treat myself poorly. Yeah, exactly. It has taken willpower to do and a true awareness of my habits.
Okay, proud of you.
And it's made a big difference. Yeah, thank you. And I'm sharing all this because I really have today's guest to thank for this big change in my life. So I'm truly excited to introduce Dr. Anna Lembke. Anna is a professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. But you may already know her as the author of the New York Times bestseller, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. So I first read this book around this time last year, and it was required reading in a meditation course I was doing. And at first, I couldn't figure out why we were reading about dopamine at like the very start of a meditation course. But as I read, I realized that the science Anna was explaining spoke to every single reason I wanted to learn to meditate and all the reasons that I heard from my fellow classmates. And what I learned from this book helped me kick my TikTok habit and had me doing all these crazy things that I could never have imagined before.
Like what?
Like I take cold showers now. At the end of my shower, I force myself to do like 30 seconds to a minute of a ice cold shower.
Wow.
And I love a hot shower.
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
It
makes me feel good. It is painful, but
in a
you
good way.
feel this rush after.
Right.
And that's exactly what Anna's talking about in this book. The relationship between pleasure and pain in our brains. And ultimately, dopamine is that pleasure. Mm-hmm. And she opens the book by writing that understanding this relationship has become essential for a life well lived. Okay, why is that? It's because we live in this world that is like everything is so abundant, and where our modern world has come up with some way to make whatever your drug of choice is more accessible and more addictive than ever before. So today, Anna's here to explain why understanding our relationship with dopamine is the key to restoring balance among all this chaos. She shares how we can learn to pause our relentless pursuit of pleasure and how doing so helps us be more present with ourselves and our loved ones. So with that, here's Anna.
You know, Buddha's middle way was a rational and life-fulfilling mandate or a bit of advice for people living more than 200 years ago. But today, we live in a drugified world where almost all the things that we consume and the things that we do, even things that we generally think of as good for us, like reading and exercise and playing games and meeting people and working, they've all become drugified in some way, which is to say they've been more potently reinforcing, they've become more accessible, more novel, more bountiful. In other words, they've been made addictive, so that we are now all vulnerable to the problem of compulsive overconsumption in a way that is really unprecedented in the history of human beings living on planet Earth, so that we really have to reconceptualize how we're going to stay in a healthy balance.
Okay, so first, you're an addiction scientist, to set the stage for listeners. What made you realize that all of these other things were essentially like universalizing the possibility of getting closer to, I don't want to use the word addiction because I think that may not be the right word in this case, but you said overconsumption.
Right, compulsive overconsumption. Well, I've been practicing addiction medicine since the late 1990s. I'm a psychiatrist. I see patients who struggle with all kinds of addictions, not just to substances, but also behaviors like sex, gambling, shopping, and then more recently, all kinds of digital media. And what I began to see was that the kinds of signs and symptoms that people with drug and alcohol addiction were having were identical to the signs and symptoms of people who are over-consuming digital media, people who were excessively shopping, people who were excessively exercising or working or whatever it may be. I just had sort of like a front seat view at the accelerating problem of compulsive overconsumption in modern wealthy nations, in large part due to the technology, which has just made all of these things more appealing, more accessible, more bountiful, right? I mean, imagine if we had as much access to unlimited cocaine as we have to TikTok. And if we think about TikTok as a form of very potent, addictive digital media, no wonder people can't can't put it down. And I also developed my own minor addiction to romance novels, which the technology facilitated. I got a Kindle. I became a chain reader. Pretty soon I didn't care about the quality of the material. I just wanted the rush that I got from escaping into this fantasy world. It started to have an impact on my ability to live in accordance with my own values, to be a good mother, to be a good doctor. At one point, I was bringing romance novels to work and reading in the 10 minutes between patients instead of getting ready for my next patient or reflecting on my last patient.
Did you have, I also laughed. I think it was Twilight, right? That you read?
Yes. Twilight was my gateway drug.
Fully understood. Also read it multiple times.
Thank you. So validating.
Did 50 Shades of Grey, and then I did not experience this overconsumption, but I fully get it. And I'm very drawn to fiction and to fantasy, so I can see how that happens. Did you have a moment when you realized, like, oh my God, what am I doing?
Yeah, I was teaching a small class of psychiatry residents how to interview patients around problems related to compulsive overconsumption / addiction. And we were one student short, so I played a student so that the psychiatry resident could practice his skills. And so in his interviewing of me, he said to me, is there a behavior that you feel you do too much of that interferes with your goals and values that you'd like to change? And I said, yeah, I'd like to change my late night reading habit. Now, I didn't plan that. It just sort of came out. I didn't share with him what I was reading. And he then proceeded to, in a very empathic way, ask me a few questions, including the important question, what's one thing that you can do? These were all kind of scripted questions, right? What's one thing you can do to help you? Just one thing you can do to help maybe decrease that activity. And I said, well, I could get rid of my Kindle because the Kindle gives me easy access to, another book as soon as I finished the first book. So that night I read my, romance novels as usual till 2 or 3 in the morning, exhausted going to work. But I couldn't unsee that conversation, which really is a powerful, I know this as a professional, but as a sort of on the receiving end of it, it powerfully speaks to the ways in which when we give voice or use the tool of language to talk about what we're doing, it becomes very real to us in a way that it's really not when it's just kind of pinging around in the dark recesses of our minds. So whether we write it in a journal or I think more powerfully make ourselves vulnerable and tell another human being, that really brings it into relief because we have a remarkable ability to have like a split brain and be having sort of this double life where we're over here doing all these, responsible, respectable things and over here kind of doing these things that we're slightly ashamed of or wish we wouldn't do, but then sort of like bury them outside of our consciousness. So in saying that out loud, like, again, I just couldn't unsee it. And then I did resolve that I wanted to change that behavior. Because although that night, again, I was watching myself read romance novels, right? So I was immersed in the romance novels, but also watching myself do it in a new kind of way.
I think it's so cool, first of all, because you became a student and then recognized your own stuff, which oftentimes, and I think when many people hear from people like you, they assume that you have this mastered, that you're not susceptible. And even as an expert, you're still human. And so like all of us, you are susceptible. And so I was a coach and still am a coach. And so what I liked about this, which I think is valuable just to like pause for our listeners who are thinking, what their version of a romance novel, whatever that is what's, and you actually correct me if I say this wrong, it's what's something that you overdo that you'd like to stop?
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of different ways to get at it. And I respect that you maybe don't want to use the word addiction, but the way that addiction is broadly defined is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. Sometimes that's harm that we can see, and sometimes it's harm that we really don't. Other people see it, or it creeps up on us, over time. There's also the phenomenon of physiologic adaptation. So that's how our brain changes in response to highly reinforcing substances and behaviors, such that over time we develop what's called tolerance, where we need more of the drug in more potent forms, not to, get high, but just actually to feel normal or to get the same effect. And when we're not using, we're in withdrawal. Exactly as people who are using opioids can start out with oxycodone, transition to heroin, then get exposed to fentanyl, fentanyl and then actually seek out fentanyl, even knowing how dangerous and lethal it is. It's because the brain's adapting, needing the more potent form over time. And, when exactly we cross from sort of like recreational adaptive use into maladaptive addictive use, it's a judgment call. Right. On the far end of that spectrum, I think we can all agree this person is not well. Most of us are not that far, right? We're somewhere along those lines. Addiction is just, it's so easy to get addicted now to almost anything, or to get in this loop of compulsive overconsumption.
Would you say I was addicted to romance novels, just so I get it clear? Would you say like I had a compulsive I don't know why this phrase keeps messing me up. Compulsive overconsumption.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I wouldn't want to trivialize the life-threatening addictions that my patients struggle from by comparing it to what I was dealing with. So I would probably categorize it as like a compulsive overconsumption, or maybe the beginning, a pre-addiction or a mild addiction. It never got to a point where like I needed professional treatment or I couldn't stop even when I wanted to. But it did get to the point of there being consequences. There was a compulsive quality to it. There was craving. And when I did stop and commit to 30 days of abstinence, I did experience withdrawal. So that tells me that there was this physiologic neuroadaptation. I also did get increasingly depressed and anxious and didn't identify that behavior as causing it until I stopped for long enough to feel better and realizing, oh, wow, that escape into fantasy was actually bringing down my mood and my overall psychological well-being. So I think, maybe mild addiction.
Well, and one or two things maybe to call out is harm isn't necessarily as like dangerous as we might think it is when we hear the word harm, right? I think what you said about, using the word addiction is oftentimes people go, well, that's not me, so I don't have to think about that. But harm can be, it's stealing your time. Like that is harm. It can be, it's keeping you, like you said, from your work. So
Absolutely.
I think it's like broadening the definition of what that is, instead of being so tightly wound around the stigma of addiction.
Absolutely. We often talk about opportunity costs. What are all the things that I'm not doing because I'm spending all my time consuming this substance or engaging in this behavior? There's spiritual harm, right? How am I now behaving in a way that's contrary to my values, right? Like lying to people about what I'm reading or where I'm going or how I spent my money.
What I did at 3 a.m.
Yeah, right. And these are all like repeated moral injuries, right?
Yeah.
Where we get into that shame spiral where now we're ashamed of those behaviors. We don't want to tolerate the shame because it's a painful emotion. So then we engage in our addictive behaviors in order to escape the shame. And the other harms that I think people really underappreciate are the subtle accumulation of psychiatric problems like depression, anxiety, inattention, sleep disturbance. Very often people will start out using whatever their drug of choice is, whether a substance or a behavior, to self-medicate those problems. And if it works for them, they'll repeat that behavior. But over time, because of neuroadaptation and tolerance, not only will the drug stop working, but it can actually turn on us and do the opposite. So I have lots of patients who start using cannabis for anxiety or to sleep, and they get to a point where cannabis actually makes them paranoid, keeps them up all night. So it's this kind of, turning that happens. So really important to talk about those things.
I think we fall into the trap of believing that this is all about willpower. And you, of course, talk a lot about dopamine. And I'm curious about the role that plays so that our listeners can understand how this is. That's not the conversation. The conversation isn't like, am I strong enough to resist this? It's much deeper, and it has to do with our neurology.
Yes, absolutely. So dopamine is our pleasure and reward neurotransmitter. We make it in our brains. It has many different functions, but one of its primary functions is, again, in the brain's reward pathway. The more dopamine that is released in response to a given substance or behavior, and the faster that dopamine is released, the more likely that substance or behavior is to be reinforcing, positive, rewarding, something that we want to do again. But what happens is that over time, the brain actually adapts to that increased dopamine firing, that is, learns that substance or behavior. and downregulates dopamine production and transmission. And with repeated use to highly reinforcing substances and behaviors, the brain actually gets to a point where it has to overcompensate and actually go into what's called a dopamine deficit state. So now we're at below normal levels of dopamine firing. And so now we've actually adversely impacted our baseline well-being. And we're in a state of craving, chronic intrusive thoughts of wanting to use and needing to use, not to get high, but just to get back up to baseline levels and feel normal. And that's really the addiction loop. It starts out as something that makes us feel good or solves a problem, but over time becomes its own problem, where now we're using just to stop feeling bad, or what George Koob has called dysphoria-driven relapse. And that's what we mean about the hijacked brain, or about people with addiction losing some degree of their agency or their ability to stop. Of course, there's always, agency there, right? Maybe it's not the ability to stop, but it is the ability to reach out and ask for help. That's what we hope, and we see people with very severe addictions, even decades-long addictions, getting into remarkable long-term recovery. So there's always hope, there's always agency, but when we're living in a world where we're constantly being invited to consume, and in fact, hunted down to consume, it gets that much harder. And if we just rely on willpower alone and don't insulate ourselves, we're not going to be able to withstand the constant temptations.
And so if it's, chocolate or, something else that we are struggling with, when you talk about the reward center and we talk about dopamine, there's the pain and the pleasure piece.
Right.
Is that pain the pain of withdrawal? Is withdrawal about having a dopamine deficit? What does it feel like to be in pain when it comes to something that isn't necessarily a substance?
What I talk about in the book is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. And at the simplest level, okay, this is an oversimplification, but at the simplest level, they work like opposite sides of a balance. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. Like, for example, dopamine is released in the reward pathway. When we experience pain, it tips the other way. But basically, the rule that governs this balance is that it wants to remain level with the ground, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, such that with any deviation to pleasure or pain, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance. And the way that our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So, for example, in my case, I read a romance novel that releases dopamine in my reward pathway. My metaphorical, simplified balance tilts to the side of pleasure. No sooner does that happen than my brain starts to downregulate dopamine transmission, which you can think of as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until I've tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, the blue Monday, or just that moment of craving, right? Wanting to read one more chapter, even though I promised I would put away. Now, if I don't read another chapter and I wait long enough, eventually the craving passes, the gremlins hop off, the pain side of the balance, homeostasis is restored, and I'm fine. But if I continue to consume that drug of choice over days to weeks to months to years, those gremlins get bigger and stronger, they multiply, and now I end up with gremlins camped out on the pain side of my balance, and I'm in a chronic dopamine deficit state. Now I need to use more of my drugs and in more potent forms, not to get high, but just to level the balance and feel normal.
Got it.
That image, or that simplified metaphor, is a way to understand why people with addiction will continue to use their drug of choice even when they say, I want to stop, and it's no longer pleasurable and it's no longer doing what it did for me. But the other thing that this balance helps inform is that if we intentionally press on the pain side, for example, by having an ice cold water plunge or by doing some kind of vigorous exercise, then actually those gremlins will hop on the pleasure side of the balance, and we will get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. And that's a much better way to get our dopamine because it's much less vulnerable to the problem of compulsive overconsumption. Why? Because we have to work for it, right? We have to put out the effort first to get it. Now, it's not completely immune to the problem of addiction. People can get addicted to exercise, to restrictive dieting, even theoretically to ice cold water plunges. And part of what makes those otherwise healthy things addictive is the technology, right? The ways that we can quantify it, count ourselves, compare ourselves to other people on social media. Like even social connection or effortful things that used to be indisputably healthy for us now have also become drugified. Work, for example, right? Work is more potent. We have all these secondary reinforcers. Work is more bountiful. There's more of it. There's no natural stopping point. We're expected to work 24/7 wherever we go. There's no, it's again, like I always think of like the line of cocaine. I mean, you have 2 lines of cocaine and then there's no more cocaine. But that doesn't happen with work, right? It just keeps going.
Isn't it funny that, you think about like old parables or things about the fact that like no magic pill, right? You got to do the hard work, actually do have a neuroscience explanation that we can look at and use and go, oh, so, maybe we didn't have the technology and the research and the ability to explain this 1,000 years ago. But, you started with Buddha's middle way, and all of these things that we've all probably heard in passing or from our parents. They're actually real.
Right. I love it. I mean, every major religion and philosophy of the world essentially has these same messages. And I feel like now we just have kind of neuroscience to show how it actually works.
Yeah. I want to talk more about some of the things we can do to push to this other side of the pain pleasure experience. But first, I want to ask you about I love that you brought up work, because this was one of my questions is like, how do you see this manifest when it comes to work? And if you're the kind of person who is maybe more susceptible to overwork or to workaholism, it's often rewarded. So like, it's not like we're functioning necessarily in an environment at work where we're going, oh, I worked so much and everyone's like, oh my God, you're terrible, or you're an outcast. It's like,
right.
No. If
you need an intervention. You need an intervention.
Yeah. No, we're like, no, who can do more of what that person's doing?
Right, yeah.
What do you make of that when you think about the fact that we are in these environments where we reward something like this when it comes to work culture?
Well, to me, this is what's fascinating about the field of addiction is its intersection with culture and the times in which we live. Which drugs are stigmatized and made illegal, which drugs are celebrated and legal. And certainly, workaholism is celebrated in our culture. Our heroes are essentially people who work almost all the time. It's very difficult to even identify a problem of compulsive overconsumption in a realm that is celebrated in a given culture. It's just almost impossible, especially something like work and productivity, which is sort of like the pinnacle of what you want in a capitalist society. So I think it's, there's not one quick, easy fix, but it's a matter of what the culture values and ourselves being very mindful about what we value and being very, very skeptical of making our most important life goods external accolades and praise and fame and money. We already know that at the end of the day, those are empty. So, what isn't empty? And, it's all the same cliches. It's finding human connection and intimacy and meaning and being of service.
Coming up, the tools you can use to intentionally reset your relationship with dopamine, and how doing so helps you stay more present and form deeper connections. We'll be right back after this short break. And we're back with Dr. Anna Lembke.
So I do want to shift before we talk about what we can do. You obviously have done this work for a long period of time, and a lot of what you're talking about comes from the science of recovery, and you've had a huge impact on the way we understand and look at the opioid crisis in this country. I myself lost a close friend to fentanyl, and so that was the first encounter I'd really had with that. I'm curious, like, what is your work and what does all of this help us understand about addiction today and and maybe in the future?
Well, I mean, my work on the opioid epidemic, arose out of my clinical practice when starting in the early 2000s, I was seeing more and more patients coming in who were addicted to the very same pills their doctors were prescribing. Not just opioids, stimulants, sedatives, things like Xanax, Valium, Klonopin. And I thought that it was just a problem of people not understanding that these substances, even when prescribed by a doctor, are addictive, and not understanding what addiction is and how it hijacks the brain. And so I decided that I would just go and tell these various prescribing doctors, hey, I'm seeing your patient over here, and they're addicted to the pills you're prescribing over there, so, you need to stop. It turned out it wasn't at all that simple. Even when I did that, they often did not feel they could stop prescribing those pills for so many complicated reasons having to do with a lot of the dysfunction in our healthcare system, the way that big pharma and the pharmaceutical industry has infiltrated not just the healthcare system and the incentives, but also the very education of medical students and doctors in training and doctors in practice. What's so interesting to me now that I've lived long enough is to see how these narratives change. And once they change, you look back and you're like, how could people have ever thought that? Like, how could doctors in the 50s have smoked cigarettes and advertised them as healthy? Like, that's so insane, right? But will we look back at giving little kids iPads and be like, that's nuts? What were we thinking giving kids iPads and giving 9-year-olds their own phones? I mean, maybe we'll look back and we'll have a similar kind of horror. Anyway, what we now take for granted, which is that the current opioid epidemic really did begin with doctor overprescribing and patient overconsuming of prescription opioids. So, I mean, what can we learn from that? Gosh, I think probably the main thing we need to learn is just continued humility in terms of our ability to really see the harm, the patterns of harm. I'm always amazed at how many people I see who are so convicted about what they think, right? And it's just sort of stunning to me. It's like, well, I mean, I have opinions also, but I try to hold a space for being wrong because I've been wrong many, many times, and because we're all so fallible and we all have blind spots. I think social media has made this issue worse. But I think what's happened with social media is that kind of nuanced, hesitant, discussion or, a qualifying sort of expression of opinion, that doesn't do it.
They don't want it.
No, that doesn't create the sort of reinforcing dopamine. So social media drives to the extremes.
The conversation of humility, I think, is really powerful. And also the idea of how can we be more honest with ourselves about what's actually happening and what we're seeing without necessarily being influenced by other outside forces. But it seems like today, to your point, in order to go viral or to look like you matter or to draw people in, you have to have a binary opinion about something. And it has to be quick because the news cycle is this quick. And I think if you're like middling or you're trying to figure out what's happening and you're saying, oh, I kind of want to pause. Like, I have more questions than answers. Generally, a lot of people don't find that to be interesting, and they don't really want to have to ask questions because it's harder to critically think than to just decide and, take a stance.
I agree with you 100%. We all have our sort of immediate gut reaction judgments, and sometimes those are right, and sometimes those are the best information that we can have for a given situation. But a lot of other times they're not, so it's just super important to just be thoughtful and to engage in the kind of hard lifting that these very complicated problems require.
I want to move to what we do about this. So, like, your book's called Dopamine Nation. So it's pointing to the fact that we're all potentially susceptible to different experiences with compulsive overconsumption. I'm going to say that 10 times and I will get it. And or addiction. I'm curious, when you think, actually, first of all, when is it important to go get professional help?
Well, I think if you're somebody who has repeatedly tried to stop on your own and been unable to, you should definitely go get professional help. If you're at risk for a life-threatening withdrawal, for example, from alcohol or sedatives like benzodiazepines, you should definitely go get professional help. Mm-hmm. But I also think it doesn't need to wait until those kinds of extreme circumstances. Really, anybody who has access to an addiction specialist who thinks that they might have a problem or knows that they have a problem, go see a professional. There is evidence-based treatment that we know works that a lot of people don't even know about, or don't engage with. So I would encourage folks, to seek out help if they suspect or know they have a problem.
Great. And so for those who are listening, if that, applies to you, I think I want to make sure absolutely that we cover that. You've talked about the importance of radical honesty as we start to reset. Can you talk a little bit about what that meant for you and what that means for us in whatever we might be overdoing?
Sure. So, radical honesty is the idea that we would make an effort to tell the truth about all things large and small, especially those kinds of little lies that we engage in almost unconsciously to cover up our faults or misdeeds or selfishness or mistake, little things that we probably don't even notice unless we're making an effort to notice them. Like someone asks, why were you late for the meeting? Or you just show up late to the meeting and, oh, sorry, traffic was really bad. No, traffic wasn't bad. I just took 5 extra minutes to drink my coffee and read the paper. Right? So, and those are like little lies. And what I have learned from patients with severe addiction who are able to get into and sustain meaningful recovery over years, decades, and lifetimes is that they have discovered, and it really is an amazing discovery, that they have to practice radical honesty. That not only can they not lie about their addictive use, but if they start lying about the little things, they will very likely slip back into their addictive behaviors, which is kind of fascinating. Like what is the link between these little lies and the bigger lies that really harm ourselves and potentially harm other people? I got really curious about that. And it turns out there's like an interesting burgeoning science about honesty and the ways in which, actively engaging in truth-telling is, number one, effortful. The average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. And so to not lie, we almost have to set up like a little watcher in our brains that keeps us accountable. And this probably activates our prefrontal cortex, which is the control center of the brain, that gray matter area right behind our foreheads that's so important for future planning, for autobiographical narrative, for appreciating future consequences. And that area probably gets activated by active truth-telling. And that area, importantly, acts as a kind of brakes on our appetites. So without that prefrontal cortex functioning as a healthy source of brakes on our appetites, we are more likely to get into trouble with compulsive overconsumption. The other thing that's really important is that a lot of relationships get destroyed through addiction. And when people get into recovery and stop using, they often find that the loss of trust persists even when they're not using, right? So their friends and family members have been so burned by their lies that it takes them a long time to trust again. And so repairing that damaged trust is a big part of recovery. And so, again, emphasizing radical honesty as a core value in the relationship can help to rebuild that trust and also creates intimacy. Like we think that when we admit the truth of our shameful behaviors that people will leave us. But in fact, the opposite often happens, that they're drawn closer, that they see their own brokenness in our brokenness. By being vulnerable, we actually foster intimacy. So for all those reasons and more, radical honesty is something that that we actually prescribe in our clinic. In addition to not using your drug of choice, I want you to try really hard not to lie about anything in the next 30 days, not even a little thing like what you had for breakfast.
The radical honesty piece is really resonant. And I definitely notice myself, particularly with small things. Like, it's funny, I personally am someone who's like, oh, I can't lie. But in reality, the little tiny lies I can do. And so it's interesting to look at yourself and go, ooh, that's an area that I probably would benefit from committing to. And I imagine a lot of people would too.
I mean, to me, what's really fascinating in the context of this age of fake news and misinformation is, for me personally, how often I want to massage a story. So I tell it, but it's a little bit, maybe there were 3 people, but I say there were 8, just like, I don't know, I can make it a little bit more.
zhuzh.
Yeah, make it a little more dramatic. And I thought, like, well, why is that? And I think it's, again, gets to some of these core feelings of like, I'm not good enough, right? Like, the way it really went down wasn't interesting, but if I just exaggerate this and exaggerate that, then I become good enough or interesting enough to be able to. And I think that's pernicious, right? Because then people don't really know what to believe of what we said, or they don't really know, they don't have the facts either. Mm-hmm. Like, they don't know what happened. Well, what exactly happened? I think in our personal conduct, if we can really make a commitment to being as honest as we can, it just kind of grounds us. I think in the long run, our lives go better. There are short-term immediate consequences because we're all fallible and we mess up and we do things that we shouldn't. And we should have consequences from those things, right? Mm-hmm. Because otherwise we're not motivated to make any kinds of changes.
Oof. Okay, that's a homework assignment.
Good luck. I'm still working on it.
Correct. I mean, maybe that's our life's work.
Right.
Okay, so I want you to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you've seen that are really effective, that if someone wanted to start doing it today, they could support this sort of rebalancing of that dopamine process.
There's a huge science around exercise and why it's good for us. And the interesting thing there is that exercise is actually immediately toxic to cells. So why on earth would that be good for us? And basically what happens is our body senses minor injury, not massive injury, that would be bad, but minor injury, and in response, upregulates production of our own feel-good neurotransmitters and hormones in response to minor injury. So there's a huge science and huge literature on the ways in which exercise boosts these kinds of chemicals that make us a little bit high.
Is that like the runner's high? Like you get into running and you're like, oh, now I've run 7 miles and I feel amazing. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And by the way, let me just say, I always advise people to play around with different sports or physical activities until they find one that works for them. I'll never forget when I was running with a friend in college. He said, when I first start running, like I feel really awful, but then like 10, 15 minutes in, I feel great. How about you? And I was like, no, when I first start running, I feel awful. And it gets worse and worse the longer I run.
There is no,
there's
no light at the end of the tunnel, but the end of that run.
Right. So the point is, you kind of got to find what works for you.
Got it.
There's also, some evidence for cold plunges. People who immerse themselves in an ice cold water bath, you see rises in dopamine levels in the latter half of that. So you don't get that initial spike of dopamine like you do with drugs, but you get a slow increase in the latter half. And then dopamine levels remain elevated for hours afterwards before coming back down to baseline. So you never go into that dopamine deficit state that drives compulsive reuse. And then, really anything that requires our effortful, sustained engagement. So this is things like meditation and prayer. Now, we don't normally think of meditation and prayer as painful, but it can be effortful, and as one of my patients, I memorably said, I realized that I don't have to feel like praying to get benefit from praying. So it's kind of the thing like doing the thing even though I don't feel like doing it, because I know I'll feel better if I do it. And there are so many things like that, in modern life, even just sitting in the quiet and unplugging from all of the incredibly powerful external stimuli that we live with today can be painful for people. Even just getting up off the couch and like walking outside their homes for many of our patients is hard and painful. So there's really been a recalibration in the modern world of like what is hard, especially since COVID. So now hard, it might just be getting out of bed in the morning, right? So again, it needs to be calibrated for the individual, but to sort of lean into the hard thing is basically what we recommend as a way, again, to sort of try to reset the reward balance.
You remind me of I forget his name, but I was listening to a behavioral scientist talk about the fact that, we have to reset our expectations about what we're going to feel like doing. And I think so many of us, I mean, myself included, it's like, I don't want to do things I don't feel like doing.
Yes.
And so, I've played sports and had to do that, as a child and as a teenager and as a young adult. But then, as I've gotten older, it's like, well, do I really have to do it if I don't feel like it? And that like you will absolutely be happy that you did it later. But one of the things you recommended is like reset your expectations and say to yourself, the night before, I'm going to wake up and I'm not going to want to do this. Like, let me just set the expectation. But there's a different part of me or like a higher part of me or however you want to say it that will choose to do it anyway.
Yes, exactly. A lot of times we talk with patients about actions before feelings. If we wait to do something until we feel like doing it, almost guaranteed we're not going to do it. So it has to be this idea that, again, becomes, it's sad, but true. It becomes sort of a value, like I will do this action because I committed to doing this action, knowing that I don't want to do this action, but having learned that when I do it, my day goes better. And when my days go better, my weeks go better. And my weeks go better, my life goes better. One of the potent images that I do use in my book of a patient who got into long-term recovery, she said it reminded her of a scene from one of the Harry Potter movies where I think Dumbledore or something goes down a darkened alley and slowly lights these lanterns along the way and then turns and looks back at the brightly lit alley. It's sort of like that. You're kind of walking in the dark and it's hard and it's scary, but you're lighting these lanterns as you go, and then you look back at this illuminated path and something, it's very positive.
Yeah, I'm curious what you would say about where this leaves us. In this work, I've dabbled in all sorts of human behavior and psychology and all of this. And one of the things I came across a few years ago that I was really excited by was the area or the field of positive psychology in just the idea that there are things we can do to engineer lives of meaning. They talk about the pleasant life, the good life, and the meaningful life. And the pleasant life sounds very similar to what we're talking about here, right? It's like, how do we find and experience pleasure? It's mostly hedonic. Pleasure rises and falls. So we're constantly looking for something else. And it makes me curious, when you said at the beginning, what do we replace some of these things with is a valuable thing to think about and to, act on. What are you saying we should be replacing this with, and what's most important and what you found anecdotally from people you've worked with and for yourself?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it really is all about human connection. And that I think we're such social creatures. And even when we acknowledge it, we underestimate the degree to which we need to be connected to other people. We need those connections to be deeply intimate, honest. We need to have people who can support us in times of need and who we can be of support to when we are struggling. And I just think we just need to remember that. There is a whole sort of attachment theory of addiction that's been written about, that basically what happens with addiction is that we are replacing human connection with this drug, which at first is like a friend and a lover, and it does everything that we could ever want and hope, and does it at our bidding and our calling, but eventually, turns on us because it stops working. And it's not just connection to other people. I think it's also connection to the world. So addiction really is a turning away. It's turning away from people, but it's also turning away from the world. And so that outward pivot toward others, toward the world, it's an outward kind of direction of motion, as opposed to this sort of ruminating inward, self-focused, self-obsessive kind of thing. And like some degree of know thyself is good, but I think we can take it too far, where we're just sort of so, involved with self. And so just turn outward, just stop thinking about yourself and be present and engage with other people in the world.
It's like simple but not easy. One of those things, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Like most valuable things in life, right?
Correct. Anna, okay, I'm going to have you answer or complete these 3 statements for me. The first one is better humans are
connected to other humans.
Better work is
in service of others.
And a better world has
people who care about each other and the planet.
Love that. Thank you so much for being here. This was fantastic, and just appreciate you sharing your time with us, and so much wisdom that I think so many people can benefit from, need access to, and may not have it today. So thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
That was Dr. Anna Lembke, author of Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. If you like this episode, you'll also love our conversation with Harvard's Robert Waldinger, the director of one of the longest-running studies on human happiness ever conducted. You can find a link in the show notes to listen. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is hosted by Leah Smart and produced by me, Emily Reeves.
And me, Grace Rubin.
Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. Tim Bolin mixes our show. We get additional support from Alex Kuznetsova and Allie McPherson. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Maya Pope-Chappelle is director of content and audience development. Courtney Koop is head of original programming. And Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. Thanks for coming with us, and we'll see you next week.